So hello everybody. Very nice to see you all here for another lecture. I'm gonna share my screen now. So 1 second. Yeah. So, my name is Hannes Müller. I'm a researcher at the Institute of Economic Analysis in Barcelona at the CSIC and also part of the BSE and of course CEPR. And I will talk about institutions, democracy, and peace. And before I start, let me tell you a little bit about Recipe and make some announcements. So Recipe is a research initiative funded by the FCDO, and we focus on how public policies can mitigate and prevent conflict. And of course, this talk is part of that effort. And we are working on all the articles summarizing the economics and political science, quantitative political science, conflict literature. And so these are going to come out very soon, I hope, or in negotiation with economic policy. And shared more broadly. But this is part of the presentation that I will give you is like this effort of going through this big literature, and then we will have financing research through open calls for proposals, and of course providing these public lectures. And I also would like to mention that I'm looking for a postdoc. If someone with a PhD who just finished their PhD or is about to finish their PhD is in this lecture and is interested in natural language processing methods for social science research, and especially with a conflict focus, then please write to me in hannesmuller@iae and csic.es or follow the link that was just shared in the chat. Thank you very much. So this is it with announcements. So let me start a little bit. So, I mean, let's start kind of a proper academic way, namely, what are institutions to start with? According to North, institutions are the rules of the game, right? So they determine how power and resources are allocated formally and informally. And then our overview with Laura Mayoral, who's a colleague of mine at the Institute, we focus on 3 dimensions of institutions, just to, kind of boil it down a little bit, because of course it's a very, very broad field. And we look at political institutions, namely democracy, electoral systems, and kind of inclusion, state capacity. This is mostly the mechanisms here are deterrence and service delivery, in which they affect conflict. And then economic institutions, here the literature has broadly focused on property rights, labor markets to some degree, and redistribution, of course. So these are kind of the 3 channels which we will look at and how institutions affect armed conflict. But before I start, I want to motivate a little bit more why we think this is kind of one of the crucial ways in which we can address armed conflict. And what you see here in this figure is a simple bin scatter, where we kind of summarized different countries' experiences across all the world and the history from 1989 till today. And on the bottom here, I'm showing you the egalitarian democracy score from VDEM. VDEM is one of these institutions that measure the quality of institutions across different dimensions, and they have several democracy scores, and the egalitarian democracy is kind of measuring how much exclusion there is from power, from public services, from access to justice. And so the higher the score is, the less exclusion there is, and the more egalitarian is this democratic system. And on the y-axis, you have the share of months with this country or this kind of group of countries suffered from violent conflict, right? And so what you see here is basically a dramatic, I think it's quite a dramatic relationship. So the most democratic 30% of the sample don't suffer almost at all from conflict. And then you have like some countries in the middle ground that are suffering a little bit. And then you have kind of 50% of the sample that are suffering a lot from conflict. So 10, 15, 25, even almost 25% of their months in the time, they are suffering from armed conflict. Right. And so this is obviously not a very clear causal relationship, because this could be driven by all kinds of things. But it is also good to know that this also holds for within countries. So when a country becomes more democratic, it also becomes less violent. And so the decrease on average is 7 percentage points lower violence extent with becoming democratic, right? And so I think this is a very interesting kind of fact to know and keep in mind. Again, this is not causal, but because conflict but it's kind of good to know. And so conflict and democratic backsliding have risen in parallel in the last decade, right? And so the question we are asking, the question I'm asking in this lecture is this a causal relationship? Can we make the world more peaceful by strengthening institutions? And what exactly would we do? And what kind of institutions do we need to strengthen in order to kind of get to peace? And so I would like to start, as a good academic, I would like to start with some theory. And, I think in this case, for this channel and for this way of addressing conflict, the theory here is quite important. So this, broadly speaking, of course, this is doing injustice to a lot of work, but broadly speaking, there's two theoretical views. One is seeing conflict as a contest for rents. And this goes back to Tullock in the 1980s, who was observing that if rents are available from somewhere, then there is wasteful effort to get to those rents, right? And so think of crime. Crime is somebody's trying to steal the rents from somebody else, and so then somebody else has to defend against that crime, and the criminal has to be more wise and invest in more tools to get to the rents, and so on and so forth. And so it's this kind of back and forth of attack and defense, getting to the rent. And the same thing has been then applied by Tullock, not necessarily, but by others, by Grossman and Skapadas in the 90s, to the study of insurgencies and internal wars. And since then, this has become a central tool for theory. So I'm just giving you 3 papers here, but basically you think of like 10s, 20s, even hundreds of papers that all use this kind of logic of people investing to get to rent and engaging in conflict effort as a policy tool. And so kind of 2 strands of literature I want to stress is work on kind of ethnic divisions and income divisions, and thinking about whether a conflict is more ethnic or is more income driven by income disparities. This is kind of going back to John Mireya Esteban and Debras Ray, and Esteban Ray and Laura Mayoral. There's 2 important papers in the 90s and in 2010s. There's other people that are contributing in this direction, but they kind of write down this kind of function, this contest function explicitly. And so there's a very, very classic examples of this tool. And then Tim Besley and Thorsten Persson in 2011 with their work on the logic of political violence. This is a paper we're going to come back to a lot. And so I'm not going to go into detail here, but this is kind of like also, again, modeling the contest for resources, in particular for the state's resources, as conflict, as armed conflict. And so what can institutions do here? Well, institutions, for example, can exclude somebody from benefiting from the state, excluding them from political power, and this will then increase their incentives to try to go through different ways, go through violence to get to benefit more from the state, to capture the state with violence. Then we have, like, typical channel here is opportunity cost. So if you have little other things to do, right? If the criminals have no jobs, then being engaged in criminal activity, then the criminal activity is going to become more interesting for them. And that's a typical channel that is modeled in these contest functions. And then restrictions of distributing the rents, right? So if there are no rents in the first place to redistribute, then of course this channel is getting less attractive. And institutions here play a big role because institutions bind our hands. There are constraints on what we can do, and therefore they also prevent us from engaging in violence to get to rents if they're not available. Yeah, Renato.
Yeah, sorry, Hannes. Hi, Hannes. Hi, everyone. There is an interesting question, Hannes, in the Q&A block. Anjali asked, "Can we say something about the origin of conflict?" I think this is an interesting question we can answer. Maybe
Yes. So of course, I'm not gonna go into detail on that question, right? Because this is about institutions as way of dealing with conflict and not about the origins of conflict. In this theory that I'm talking about here, there is very little on like where does conflict come from, really, because it is more about the rent itself driving the conflict, right? So it's just really think about pots of money that is the state is generating through taxes, for example, and this is a prize to be won by the people contesting for political power. And if this political power is not distributed in a good way through institutions, then this will trigger violence, and people will try to get to these rents through the violent means. But of course, there's millions of variants of this argument. A very classic one is, for example, for mining and oil resources that are, again, these are rents that are coming kind of out of the soil, and these rents can be tried to capture, and this this again can trigger conflict. So this is a kind of a typical rent-driven story here, and this is kind of the way that context functions are usually used to describe conflict. Right? Of course, we know that there's many other reasons why people engage in armed conflict. I'm going to come back to this in the next slide. But this is kind of like in the contest way of looking at this, probably typically economic rents. I mean, Debaraj and Ray and Esteban Mayoral and Ray, they also have a lot of things on public services broadly defined, right? Some of them are like, for example, what is the religion that is the state is promoting, right? And so this is generating a kind of undivisible kind of rent, right? And so this is also triggering conflict. Okay, so the second theoretical view is kind of following James Farron in 1995, and this has been a big, I would say, it's a seminal paper because it kind of brings standard rational thinking of why do we have conflict in the first place into the conflict studies field. And he's basically saying the underlying way to think about conflict is negotiations. And this is also Chris Blackman's book in 2022 that just came out basically a few years ago. He's asking why we fight. And basically in his first chapter, he says, be noted that most of the time we don't fight, right? Most of the time we resolve conflicts we have between ourselves peacefully. And so the underlying building block of this model is basically that there are constant negotiations that are governing our interactions in society, right? And this needs to be regarded as the backdrop for violent conflict, because we need to understand when do these negotiations fail, and only then can we understand why we fight. And so here, Farron says, one reason is incomplete information. And this again is mirrored echoed by Blackman in his book. Commitment problems, issue indivisibilities, and these are the three examples that Farron gives. And then Blackman updates this a little bit and talks about unchecked interests and misperceptions, right? So where this is kind of a more behavioral economics argument, and unchecked interest is more in terms of accountability within the group, rather than assuming that people represent their group properly, right? And so I'm not going to get into all the details that these two very, very large works are kind of drawing out. But I just want to give you a little hint of like an important aspect that is very, very central to how institutions work. And this is the commitment problem channel. Think of two groups that are in constant negotiations and they are peaceful at the moment. Now, one group realizes that the other one is gaining in power. And imagine that the one that is right now stronger is the one that is stagnating instead. And so it's the weaker group today that is gaining power through, for example, like booming economically. And the other one is stagnant economically. And so it knows that in future, the other one will be stronger, right? And so you could then say, well, okay, the weaker group today would perhaps agree to a deal where they keep paying a fairly large amount to the stronger group. They assume almost that they don't improve their position relatively and keep paying some amount to the stronger group that doesn't reflect the future distribution of power. And this is not credible because the weaker group today that will be stronger tomorrow will want to turn around and go to the stronger group tomorrow and say, hey, hold a second, we are actually stronger today. We want to renegotiate the way we have been dividing our resources in society. And so this generates a massive problem dynamically because the strong group today has an incentive to attack the weak group today violently to kind of finish it off or like prevent it from growing stronger, right? And some of you might know this argument kind of regarding China and US relationships, right? This is like a classic thing in international politics as well, but of course also holds within countries. And we're going to see in a second, we're going to see another example from within countries, right? And so institutions here can provide commitment, and this is one way in which they prevent and regulate violence. Another one is they help information to flow more freely, and they deliver accountability within groups, and this is kind of prohibiting this kind of unchecked interest channel, right? And so kind of like what I want to kind of say here is that there's different ways of thinking about conflict in the first place and why we have them. And depending on how you think about conflict, you might think about the roles of the role of institutions. And so one thing we did, or we're doing in the overview article, is that we actually try to think about can we try to, and of course this is hopeless in a way, but we like in the sense of like really abstracting out and trying to only take the most important channels we can think of or we can see in the literature, in the way which institutions help to regulate armed conflict. And so these are the three institution blocks we think about: economic institutions, political institutions here, and state capacity down here. And what we are saying is that, or what we are seeing in the literature is that there's a very, very strong link from political institutions to state capacity and from state capacity back to political institutions. Then there is a direct causal link from state capacity, strong state capacity, to armed conflict. And this is coming mostly, again, there's lots of variance to this, but mostly through commitment, providing commitment device and through deterrence. Then political institutions directly affect armed conflict through commitment, through inclusion, and through the flow of information, and to some degree, as I said before, generating accountability. And then both of these institutions affect the armed conflict outcomes indirectly through the way they affect the economy, right? And so this actually has two channels. So one is political institutions that affect economic institutions directly, and then economic institutions affect work, income, and public services. Of course, these are different economic outcomes, and these represent just different economic outcomes. These are three very interesting channels: work, income, and public services. But of course, there's more, right? An economic institution, you should think property rights, labor markets, and so forth. And then these, in addition, affect economic outcomes, right? So we already talked about rents, we talked about opportunity costs, and there's another one, which is economic inclusion, that I will talk briefly about in a minute. Right, and so what we do in our overview paper is we try to structure the entire literature. There's a massive literature in these kind of different bubbles. And all I'm trying to do now in the next kind of 15 minutes is to quickly go through some of these channels as examples. And then what I will do after that is I will talk about one specific, very particular where institutions, a channel in which institutions directly affect armed conflict. And this is something that I've by myself worked on. And so I think this is interesting. Renato.
Yeah, Hannes. So there are a couple of interesting questions that relate to this final thought. So Felipe asked, where do you think that informal institutions come into the game? For example, groups or associations in communities. Would they be categorized as political institutions?
Yes, absolutely. No, this is completely true. And of course, this is exactly the kind of thing you sacrifice when you make these kind of broad bubbles, right? There is, of course, political institutions both at the local level and political institutions at the international level, which I would both put them here under political institutions, and they are both extremely relevant for violent outcomes, right? Think of things like the United Nations, or think of local institutions, think of exactly associations, unions, all this kind of things. So unions are more here, right? But associations, you're completely right. Also local governments, right? They're all here, or sometimes they're also here. Yeah, Renato.
Yeah, and also Angela asked, does this theory, this institutional conflict theory, apply to both domestic and international conflicts, or are there any specificities?
So the literature we are focusing on is mostly internal conflicts, and there are significant differences between international and national, intranational and international conflicts. So the logic is quite different in some respects. But what Chris Blackman stresses in his book is that the idea of negotiations as the kind of fundamental building block and the thing we need to understand also applies to international conflicts. So to some degree, I will kind of touch upon international conflicts, but the main literature is quite different in international conflict versus intranational conflict. So I will mostly focus on the kind of civil war type of violence.
Great, thanks, Hannes.
Okay, so let me talk through a few channels, right? And I will not do justice to this broad literature, and of course the overview paper will come out quite soon, and I encourage you all to look it up when it comes out and see all the much more detail. And so the first channel I want to talk about a little bit is the economic opportunity cost channels, right? And so democracies tend to improve economic opportunity, and this raises the cost of violence. Very simply, actually, this is in both models, in the rent-seeking model and in the negotiation model. These are very kind of classic triggers of kind of lowering conflict. And there has been an RCT in Liberia that has been run by Blattman and Annan, and has come out in, I think it's AGPS in 2016, that shows, if you give ex-fighters economic opportunities, they demobilize quicker, and so you have you're generating a more stable environment. Dominic Rona in 2024 wrote an overview article of several strategies by which you can fight conflict, and the opportunity cost channel here is discussed in a lot of detail. One very interesting difference or interesting kind of element here is the difference between wages and like work programs and transfers, where you just kind of give people money, because transfers can also be seen as rents, right? And of course, if you give rents, then people might fight more about them. Whereas if you give people work, this just generates work for themselves, and they're actually busy working and they can't fight. And so these two things, even though on paper and in development policies wise, they look quite similar. And actually, I think in the latest literature on development aid, I think transfers have been seen as quite favorable. In the conflict literature, the jury is still kind of out whether transfers help or actually makes things worse, and it depends on the situation. And then there's a workfare program in India, which is analyzed by Timo Fetzer, which directly now relates to conflict, this paper. And he shows that if you have weather shocks and people become desperate after weather shocks, then you can really prevent conflict by providing these workfare programs, right? And so these, of course, are just 3 examples of a large literature, but there's quite a lot of evidence on the fact that these kind of economic institutions or political institutions working through economic outcomes can really help in preventing conflict. Then we have rent seeking and resource competition as a channel. This is very standard kind of like contests view. The contest views has been very strong here. Berman et al. Are talking about mining revenues as a driver of conflict. They show that economic institutions here can be really helpful, namely if you force multinationals to be transparent in the way they distribute the rents, and this is constraining the distribution of rents, and therefore you're reducing conflict. A very recent paper that just came out talks about cultural distance between ethnic groups, and so here you should think of like public services that are distributed by the state as the rent that people are fighting over. And they show that if a group enters power that is culturally more distant to a same group in the same country, then this can trigger conflict. So generating cultural distance between the group in power and another group in the same country can shift public services and the way the public services are provided, and this then kind of like annoys or triggers conflict, right? Because exactly this kind of, you can think of this both in the rent distribution kind of view and in the negotiation kind of view. And a very interesting paper that is not about conflict, but is kind of, I think, one of the strongest papers in terms of showing the power of institutions is a paper by Burgess et al. In 2015 that shows road building happened in Kenya according to who was in power, which ethnic group. And so you see that the roads are built much faster in ethnic areas that have kind of often the same ethnicity as the leader at the time. And so you have first some roads being built here, and then when the ethnic leader changes, the sudden roads are built in a different area. But, and very interesting, there's also interesting transitions into and out of democracy in Kenya. And you can see that in democratic periods, this channel basically is completely muted. So it is much harder under democracy to favor your own ethnicity. And what does that mean? That means directly that you have less incentives to engage in violence to reach to political power, because you know that rents are not going to be distributed towards you if you're on a democracy, right? So this is kind of like, it's not showing it all the way. That's not showing very strongly that, you know, it affects violence, but it affects kind of the channels by which we think about violence comes about. And then Timo Fetzer, he shows using data from Nigeria that local democratic institutions can really regulate much better the competition for oil rents, and this can actually prevent local violence from happening. So we have, I would say here in this channel, we have a lot of very, very strong evidence that if you design political institutions correctly, especially local political institutions, then you can prevent some of the worst armed violence for trying to grab resources. Okay, so the next kind of literature I want to talk about quickly is bargaining failures, institutional commitments. And so here, this is kind of like a more theoretical literature that then has kind of had like some nice historic backings. And so the idea is that democratization can act as a credible commitment to redistribution. So the way that Acemoglu and Robinson in 2001 describe the rise of democracy is through the following image. Imagine that you have your king, and your kingdom is quite weak at the moment. So your kingdom, in a sense, the crown is weak. It has a weak military at that moment because of some shocks that happened. And you have turmoil inside the country, and the peasants rise up. They arm themselves and they stand in front of your palace and they're shouting and they're threatening to burn you and whatnot, right? And you can say, okay, from tomorrow onward, I will redistribute in a fairer way the benefit we have in the kingdom, and I will give you a bigger share of what we have and what we are producing. But this promise is not credible, right? Because it's exactly this kind of commitment problem that I was describing before about two different countries or two different groups, one being weak and one being strong. If you're strong, if you're weak today, but you might be strong tomorrow again, you're having a hard time committing yourself, right? And so the king might want to commit, might want to agree to a better distribution of rents today, but the peasants know that tomorrow maybe the army is back from an expedition to France or something, or like the military will be stronger, and then they will all be attacked again by the king, and so they cannot agree to this offer. And so what does the king do? What can the king do? Well, the king can generate a parliament, like a political arm, a political commitment to say from now on, from tomorrow onward, a part of the population will have the ability to vote and take part in political power. And so redistributing political power through institutions is a way to prevent violence, right? And so this, I think, is a very, very interesting channel because it's kind of a dynamic argument. It's not about like today things are bad and then people rebel and they become violent, but it's about what can I promise them today that will make them not being violent, right? And it's exactly this promise done through institutions that can really work much better to reduce violence. And there's different case studies in history that have studied this, even from the United States background, that this really works. And then I think it's almost the last channel I will talk about in detail is the state capacity and deterrence, where there's a large literature following basically in person. And so here, a very, very kind of plain argument is you will have less violence if you have a very, very strong state, because the very, very strong state has a monopoly over violence, and therefore nobody will want to rise up to the state and attack the state, right? Of course, this kind of, you could think of this as like two-sided sword, of course, because the state can also be used against people. And so what Besley and Person argue is that really the strongest states can only arise in an environment where political institutions are also beneficial for everybody and constrain rent extraction, because otherwise you would always have some weakness at some stage where the other group wants to capture the state and wants to grab the resources. And so if you don't prevent rent extraction, the state itself becomes the price to fight over, and in the long run, nobody wants to invest so heavily in state capacity. And so they show that quite convincingly in their models, that kind of in the long run, even in the short run, you might have like, strong autocrats, but in the long run, it's much, much harder to keep this in an equilibrium. And so it's this kind of like two institutions, like the political institutions and the state capacity in this two-way causal relationship that are keeping things stable and that lead to also the absence of violence in the long run. And this kind of theory of state capacity as such an important thing has had quite a big impact very recently through ingenious studies that are on detailed fragile countries. For example, Sanchez de la Sierra, he's looking at the DRC, and he's showing within the DRC there are kind of dynamics where local armed actors are what's called becoming stationary bandits, right? Where they settle down and they start to look a little bit like small states. They provide public services, they tax people locally. And this is also associated with the reduction of violence typically, because if bandits are roving, if they're driving around and looting, then of course this is a very violent behavior typically. But if they become stable and they have an interest in taxing people, then of course they want to put themselves down, invest much more in the people and the locations that they're at, and also provide public service to the population. So because they know that tomorrow they can tax more, right? And so these are the origins of something that we have seen in many states that are forming, And so this is very interesting to look at in these kind of more fragile environments, that kind of the logic actually still holds in terms of overall relationship. And kind of what I want to stress before I get to kind of the next part of the presentation is to talk about non-exclusion here as such a really, really crucial element in the way that kind of states can prevent violence. And so if you have strong states, of course, there's this repressive element, right? There's this kind of ability to inflict violence on people that rise against the government. But there's also the ability to provide public services, right? And so if you manage to have a state that doesn't exclude anybody from public services, like access to justice, like infrastructure, like access to property rights, then this will generate an agreement, and there's some, I even would say, like a cultural change that is providing legitimacy to the state. And this is heavily conflict reducing, right? Because people don't have an incentive to rise up against the state. And so a state that has strong capacity, that is using it in a non-exclusive way to distribute public services, tends to be something that is extremely stable. And so we can see this in kind of across countries, but we can also see this from very, very detailed, very specific, almost weird kind of cases where, for example, counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq, analyzed by Berman et al., shows that you can send as many soldiers as you want, and you will never pacify a region as much as if you are sending some soldiers to provide security, but then you immediately also move into a place and provide public services. So they show these kind of dual systems where development policies were done in tandem with providing kind of security, and they show that these are much, much more effective to decreasing violence, right? And this I think is a very strong thing that has been shown again also in the context of Congo, and there's a lot of work done right now with RCTs. They're showing that this kind of dual system where you tax people but you also provide public services leads to a lot of stability. So the problem is that this is causally, I've talked one direction, but of course it's much more complex, the world, right? Conflict, for example, erodes institutions. We know things like coups exist, right? And so weak institutions allow conflict to persist and come, and political instability also reduces the incentives to do state building. And so there's also a backflow channel, right? And I've talked about repression being like really something that can also arise under strong institutions. And so you have, it's not always a linear pattern we see in the data or in the case studies, right? So this is, I'm caricaturing it in a very broad way, but of course, the literature is aware of things kind of can get worse if the state gets stronger, for example, or doesn't necessarily always improve the situation economically for everyone if a country democratizes, for example, right? And so there's many cases like this, and of course there's kind of backflow channels. So the pattern I started with between democracy and peace is something that, of course, is also constructed from causal drivers in the other direction, where kind of a peaceful environment allows institutions to develop further and the economy to develop further, and therefore this then stabilizes things again. Okay, I will now want to, okay, yeah, Renato.
Yeah, Hannes, I think there's a question super related to these country cases you mentioned. Megan asked, does your research include any insights on how these theories might explain successful non-violent civil resistance, such as the movements in South Africa, US, and India?
Yeah, so there is, I forgot now, and I'm very sorry. If you write these two down, I think it's Lacroix 2023, but it could also be Iden Frank. I can check again. One of these papers is actually from the United States and is talking about the Black rights movement and exactly this kind of big kind of breakthrough within the United States. And of course, this started as a resistance movement in a way. But I think that typically the successful movements are the non-violent ones, right? The violent ones, I would say, tend trigger a reaction by the state that then spirals into violence and so on and so forth. But I mean, I think we have examples of kind of violent events in the past, like the French Revolution and so on, triggering, riots later on. But this is happening at a scale of centuries and not decades. And so I'm hesitant to give the policy advice that violent resistance movements are a good idea. Given, of course, we know that in the European history, the peasants' revolts and the French Revolution have been part of the democratization, right? And but I would say peaceful movements have had quicker successes in modern history. Okay, so I want to now kind of shift gears, and to do that, I wanna talk about one specific policy that is kind of more relevant for policymakers who are actually as outsiders or as insiders in countries involved in kind of dealing with fragile states. And this is kind of to share work I've been doing on power sharing agreements. So we know that institutions are very hard to reform, but power sharing targets politically exclusion directly. And so power sharing is emphasized in post-conflict design as something that could work really well. I have a paper with Dominic Rona on Northern Ireland, and so there it works really well. But their effects are difficult to identify causally. And so what I do with my colleague at the Institute, Christopher Rao, is we try to provide a methodologically new idea to kind of track the effect of power sharing agreements. I'm not going to manage to, I think, discuss the entire paper as I planned, because it took me a bit more longer here to go through the slides, but I think it's worth shifting gears now and think a little bit more about like specific policy, power sharing agreements as a way of reducing violence and how we tackle this. So this is what I'm going to talk about. It's a paper that's called Power Sharing: Building Bridges to Peace with Christopher Rao. And it kind of a default instrument for peacemaking are peace agreements. The focus we have in this paper is on agreements with power sharing elements. And the study we do is a quantitative study of power sharing agreements and peacekeeping missions. And we ask, is there an effect on internal political violence? And also, can they kind of build a bridge to broader changes that are more stable? And so the data we use is the UCDP data. This is a classic data set that is quantifying political violence. And we use an interesting data set which is called PAX, which codes 440 power sharing agreements in the period 1989 to 2020. And we also add data from UN peacekeeping troops, and they're present, and we generate this. And finally, we use a webpage that we launched ourselves, and I think it's Renato is also involved in. It's called conflictforecast.org. And this is a webpage that predicts the outbreak of armed conflict in the future using machine learning and news text. And we update monthly. And I'm going to tell you in a second how we use this risk, but this is another data set we bring to the table when we analyze the effect of power sharing. So we analyze two types of power sharing agreements. One is called a comprehensive agreements by the PAX dataset, and one is kind of any agreement, basically. And these agreements can be quite small things. So in the sense, they can just be ceasefire agreements with a little bit of a power sharing element. And what I'm showing you here is that the PAX dataset codes comprehensive agreements as basically having more elements of all kinds of things, like there's more security sector reform, there's more mention of governance, more mention of human rights, equality, and so forth. And one thing that I find very, very interesting is this difference here. So you see that there's a very, very strong difference between any agreement and comprehensive agreements on justice sector reform. And so this is where also our paper is kind of trying to contribute a little bit and thinking maybe there is something with justice sector reform in the moment you're doing a power sharing agreement. And so this is the data plotted on power sharing agreements using our forecast data. And so what we do is we order all observations according to how high the risk our machine learning algorithm thought was the likelihood that there will be violence in the future, or how intense will this violence be. And what you see is that the likelihood of having a power sharing agreement goes up from almost 0 to around 8% in the sample. And so the observations with the highest risk are the ones that are also most likely to have a power sharing agreement, right? And the ones that have almost 0 risk, they are very unlikely to have a power sharing agreement. And this is how this looks, right? So we have, for example, Mozambique being very violent, fatalities on a log scale here, so intense violence. And then the power sharing agreement comes and the violence stops. Then you have no violence for some time, then violence breaks out again, then there's another power sharing agreement. These are the comprehensive ones, and these are the any ones, right? Then you have Angola, you see power sharing agreement, violence stops, it breaks out again, there's another agreement, it stops very shortly this time, only for a month, then it breaks out again, then you have another agreement and it kind of peters down, then it breaks out again, then they try something, it doesn't work, it goes up, they bring it slowly down a little bit, but then they bring it down again here, right? Then you have another agreement here, and then there's peace afterwards. Then you have one that is failing here, Iraq. You have lots of violence intensifies, there's agreement, but nothing works, right? So it's not that this is like always working, but you see definitely cases where it's clearly seems to work, right? And so what we're asking is like, on average, does it work? And how much does it on average reduce violence? And the problem we are facing, and this is what I was mentioning before, when you study institutions, the causal effects are going all directions, right? And so this is something that is highly problematic. You can have something that is called an identification problem. And I want to start mentioning an identification problem coming from medicine, right? And this is because I think telling the story this way helps people understand how this works. And so if you think of a doctor who is a very, very good heart surgeon, she's maybe the best heart surgeon in Spain, say, and she gets very, very difficult cases. And then we think about how is her mortality rate, the patients that she's operating, how is mortality rate for those patients? And we see that the mortality rate of these patients is 50%, whereas for the average surgeon, it's only 20%. Right? You might conclude, oh, this is a terrible heart surgeon, but we might also think, oh, but maybe she gets the cases where the mortality risk, the underlying risk, is much higher. So the patient condition that this heart surgeon sees is a very different one than the average heart surgeon. And so this is summarized in this picture, where we are interested in what's the effect of this heart surgeon on mortality, but we cannot analyze this error alone because there's this other kind of causal link from patient condition to mortality through the underlying risk that is kind of messing with our measurement, right? And it's, I'm sorry. Stop my. Just stop my. Something. Sorry, this. This was very weird. I just did something with my slides. And so she is very effective, but we are facing this identification problem. And so this, we cannot observe the causal effect here. And so this is also true for peace agreements, right? Peace agreements select into very bad situations. Nobody goes to Sweden to kind of to study to try to produce this peace agreement because there is no need for it, right? And so because power sharing agreements and peace agreements are selecting into kind of high risk situations, we have an identification problem, right? This I showed you here, right? And so we will see a positive association of power sharing agreements and violence, but this is because we haven't controlled for this risk. And this is exactly what we do in the study. We try to bring our forecast into an identification problem. And so call the adoption date 0. This is when the power sharing agreement is signed, and define treatment windows around this, so 12 months before and after. And then draw a random control window of the same size where you give a placebo treatment and you say, let's assume or pretend that this other country had been treated in 0, right? And then match this kind of other window to the treatment window with the risk that they experienced in the 3 months before the date 0, and so on dates -3, -2, -1. And so what does this do? What this does is we are now looking at countries where we have another country in a very different situation that had a similar conflict risk, and we compare one country that has a power sharing agreement signed and another country that doesn't have a power sharing agreement signed, right? And so this way we are able to compare two countries with the same underlying conflict risk, and we are able to control for that. And because we're able to control for that, we can finally look at this arrow alone. And we're not mixing peaceful from not peaceful countries and risky from not risky countries. And this is, of course, leading to a much stronger causal identification, right? And so the difference in difference estimates we get from this study by matching countries on risk is that there is no pre-trend for these countries. And once the agreement is signed, the occurrence of violence drops dramatically and the intensity of violence also drops dramatically. And this is, I have to stress this, is very much different from the standard correlation you would get if you just looked at how likely is violence after a power sharing agreement versus not, because of course there's many instances where there's no power sharing agreement, where there was no underlying risk, right? And so this is kind of an effect that we only see by matching countries correctly. And so comprehensive agreements are even a stronger effect. And so this is confirmed in regressions that we can run. We can also look at peacekeeping units. Peacekeeping units pile in the moment we have a power sharing agreement. So part of the effect of an agreement could come through peacekeeping, but we do find that if we control for peacekeeping, the effect is exactly as strong as before. And so the necessary ingredient, if we interpret this way, is coming from the power sharing agreement, and it's not necessarily peacekeeping. And so you can also look at forecast errors. We can look at what does the forecast error do before an event comes. And we can see that our forecast at conflictforecast.org is becoming too pessimistic before a power sharing agreement is signed. So basically, what does this mean? This means that right at point of signature, our machine learning algorithm thinks that there might be very likely be violence, but the violence in effect is actually then much lower. And so this is obviously a very, very reassuring thing, because it says that the machine learning algorithm would not have foreseen basically the effect of the treatment. And so let me wrap up in like just 3 minutes, and then I'll answer all the questions that are coming in. We have very strong findings from a difference in difference that is matched, right? We have 7 to 14 percentage points reduction in occurrence of violence, 34 to 59% reduction in intensity. The results are only weakly statistically significant for all agreements, but strong, very strong for comprehensive agreements. And we also see that the forecast errors difference in difference is showing the forecast is too pessimistic right before an agreement. And so power sharing kind of agreements are surprising to our machine learning algorithm. And so these are very robust, these results. And so then what we do, and this kind of brings me back to what I started with, the broader idea of institutions and how they can help kind of building bridges to peace, is that we also look at the relationship between different VDEM scores and violence using two-way fixed effect regressions. And we find that the egalitarian democracy score, as I said before, I said 7% before, it's a very similar result here, is associated with reductions in violence. Of course, this is not causal, right? So this like it needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. This is just if a country is improving its democracy score, on average, it also reduces its level of violence. And when we drill into these findings, we find that the strongest association with reductions in violence is coming from less exclusion by socioeconomic group, less exclusion by gender, less exclusion by urban-rural location, impartial public administration, access to justice, and predictable justice. And so I think this is, of course, and now these are now correlations, but I think we can take these correlations and we can take the causal effect from power sharing agreements in the short run, in the 12 months afterwards, and we can look at these kind of long-term shifts in violence that are associated with these things, and we can think about, is this perhaps due to the fact that power sharing agreements are the starting point of a rethink of the role of the state and the way that institutions are used to protect the population through access to justice and through all these things that I talked about before, the non-exclusion, the non-political exclusion, the non-economic exclusion that is regulated by political institutions, right? And so some of the people we talked to at the German Federal Foreign Office that helped us with the study and advised us basically when we're doing our research, also said, yeah, sometimes in this kind of like in this part of people that are doing this kind of job, it is seen as kind of like there is a constitutional writing moment sometimes, not always, but especially in these comprehensive agreements, there's kind of like a big emphasis on kind of a grand bargain, and people are giving a lot of salience to these agreements, and there is a kind of can be a certain vibe about them that kind of reconfigures institutions significantly. And so I just want to say this, throw this out here, that what we find is that access to justice is really dramatically associated with reductions in violence, and we think that this has to do with kind of moving from kind of an elite bargain model where it's just the elite bargaining with themselves to reconfiguring the role of the state in providing public services like justice to a broader part of the population. And that just makes this more stable in the long run, right? And I think this is, of course, kind of backed up now by some of the literature that we have and some of the findings that we already have. But I think more research is exactly needed on how exactly this works out and exactly how these justice institutions come in and help and support a lasting peace. So I will stop here, and I'm looking forward for the Q&A.
Thanks, Hannes. So thank you so much. This has clearly sparked a lot of engagement. So there's been a rich flow of questions and reflections in the chat, so I will try to summarize them into 3 broad themes. Given the time, feel free to touch on any of these briefly before we move into the open discussion. So the first topic is institutions and conflict. There's a curiosity about how political institutions shape conflict dynamics, especially in cases like the Democratic Republic of the Congo and recently Sudan, and how state fragility interacts with accountability and governance challenges.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, right? I have to say first that I'm not an expert on either Sudan or the Congo, right? So the DRC. I can only speak from like the things that we know from the literature. And so the first paper I wanna talk about a little bit more is De la Sierra. And so De la Sierra studies the effect of stationary bandits, so these armed groups that are becoming stationary when resource rents go up, and he studies them and contrasts them with the effect of the military. And what he finds is that the presence of the military by the locals is associated with higher security, but is not associated with other public services like justice services. And he doesn't make that point very strongly, but I think what this is suggesting is that perhaps this is a lost chance, because it's basically the military comes in but doesn't have the capacity to provide any other service than the security service they're providing, right? And of course, local people that know that this is of course not a perfect security service at all by any means, but comparable to the armed actors that are also active in Congo. But the other actors are providing so much more, and they're providing public services, and they're starting to build this deal, kind of like, if you want to speak at this, so talk it this way, is winning hearts and minds, right? And I think it is about who people are accountable to. So in the sense that the armed actors are only accountable to themselves, and they know that this will be their only income revenue source, and so they really want to protect it. And protecting it also means they know winning the population over, and so they invest to some degree in kind of winning the population over. And we have seen these strategies by local armed actors, not only in the DRC but elsewhere as well. And of course, this is something that is seen as very effective against even militarily stronger state actors, right? If those state actors are not providing the same kind of deal for the local population, because then the local population withdraws their support to the state. And so if the military is not fully accountable to the government, or is accountable to kind of like corrupt officials that don't care about the welfare of the local people in some faraway region, then this can generate this kind of asymmetry where the armed actor is, to some degree, I know this is all with a lot of quotation marks, like behaving better, right, than the state. And then, of course, this leads to more support to the armed actor, and this leads to, even on a purely military side, a very hard time for the state to actually establish a strong monopoly of violence. And so many countries that are fragile to the degree that Sudan and the Congo are, this is exactly what is happening. That basically the state is not seen as the provider of security, and definitely not seen as the provider of other services. And so then the entire situation is fragile to a degree that there's no good way out in simple military terms, right? And so there needs to be a rethink of how can public services be reconfigured so that they reach people in those areas.
Thanks, Hannes. The second group of question was about trust and alternatives to the state. So there's also curiosity, others have pointed out, to the importance of local level dynamics, such as trust, solidarity, and information networks, and how these shape whether people rely on the state or alternative actors like rebel groups. So there's an interest in what practical strategies states can adopt to improve legitimacy in such context.
Yes, no, this is a very good question. Let me just say a bit more on trust, because I think that it's a very interesting. There's a few interesting papers, a few interesting articles that study this. So trust is both regarding trust towards the state, but it's also trust towards the other ethnic group, right, that lives close by. And of course, we have seen this in very, very dramatic situations like Rwanda, right, where of course trust needed to be rebuilt between ethnic groups. And this was a very difficult process, but I think there is some evidence that transitional justice efforts worked. And there's also evidence on like radio propaganda and quote unquote now of the good type being used to demobilize people that were still willing to engage in violence. And so I think that, from what I see from the literature, I would say a two-pronged approach helps, right? One is very clear communication about, common identity parts. This is coming from a paper on Cup of Africa championship wins by Durante and his co-authors that show that on the African continent, the moment the national team wins the championship, you do have stronger identity locally by different ethnic groups within the same country towards the nation, actually. So it is able to reconfigure to some degree what people feel like and who they identify with. And of course, this is very good for conflicts between ethnic groups if they kind of have also a shared identity, so a shared national identity. And so it is this kind of cultural element that comes in, right? And so this can kind of partly be done through communication, but this is of course also partly a function of, again, what I said about exclusion from public services, like justice systems, and like even infrastructure projects, right? And so these can help to build this legitimacy and build the cultural elements that support state capacity. And I just want to stress this, that Besley and Person, in the most recent papers, they have shifted away from just state capacity in political institutions towards culture and taking culture very seriously as a factor and as a support factor. For example, tax compliance is massively influenced by whether you believe the state serves you, right? And so it is a tit for tat where the state needs to give public services, people then trust the state more, then they are willing to pay taxes. But the moment they pay taxes, they also expect more services. And so the state then needs to be able to pay back through services. And there's several papers with RCTs that have shown this in the case, I think, of Rwanda or the DRC, where local people were told that they need to pay taxes this time and there will be somebody who checks on them. And then they were asked a few months later what they expect from the state. And you could see that the people that had been kind of triggered that they will be taxed more, expected more immediately from the state. So you can actually enter kind of the spiral upwards and downwards, but there's an upward spiral that is possible where you trigger higher expectations, but you trigger also more compliance. And this can then help build the state. And so it's like different things, political, communication, and economic, that all need to come together to exit the spiral.
Great, thanks, Hannes. I think we can move now to the open discussion. So please, everyone, feel free to raise your hand so we can have some live like interactions. I think Hans wanted to ask something. I don't know whether he still wants to that. If not, I can ask one more question that was in the chat. Okay, so there's one question here. Okay, so the last group of questions was about evidence and framing. So some participants are asking for clarification on the empirical basis behind claims like the rise of democratic backsliding, and also raising some concerns about theoretical frameworks that may feel overly Western-centric. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that's very good. I like that. So I think there is a debate amongst political scientists whether the political backsliding statement is correct. But I'm looking at the VDEM data, and if you look at the VDEM data, you see it very clearly across all dimensions of the VDEM score. You see a slight decrease across countries. I mean, I'm a white man, heterosexual man. I cannot be more normcore, and so I do think I'm aware of my own biases, and of course there is some bias in this literature in terms of like how we define democracy, for example. I do think, though, that it is worth pointing out that some of the findings, I think, apply more broadly, and especially when it is about exclusion from public services and what the literature calls checks and balances. I do think that other regimes that are not having elections become more stable when they have some checks on the power of the executive. And if they don't have this power, then, and if they don't have these checks and balances, then the moment the individual in the center of the executive kind of is having psychological problems, or be it what it is, right? They can drive the entire country to the ground. And so we know from history that massive concentrations of power in the executive in the hands of very few people or just one person are inherently not stable. And this doesn't need to mean that you need to have elections, I think, but elections are one way of generating checks and balances through having a parliament, for example. But I think that there is other ways to generate executive constraints that allow a country to move into a better space and a more stable space, even from a very autocratic perspective.
Thanks again, Hannes, and thanks to everyone for the great questions and discussion.
Yes,
It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Renato, for being such a great moderator. See you. Bye.